Right. Mr. Friedman.
We act for Disability Action Northern Ireland, which is a disabled people's organisation, or DPO, run by and for disabled people. My lady, disabled people in Northern Ireland make up 1 in 4 of the population. They have physical and mental impairments, both visible and non-visible, that arise in the ordinary diversity of human existence. But disabled people in Northern Ireland are also disabled due to the harm caused by its still recent history of conflict. Despite the integral relevance of disabled people to the fabric of society, Northern Ireland relied on the UK to count the deaths of its disabled people during the Covid-19 pandemic, as it lacked real-time data on the subject. In England, mortality figures for disabled people were published in June 2020. Northern Ireland had to wait until December 2021. Only then did it discover that between March and September 2020, disabled people were 40% more likely to die of non-COVID causes and 48% more likely to die of COVID than non-disabled peers. 5,000 people died in Northern Ireland over some 20 months of the pandemic. That is a shattering loss to a society of only 1.8 million people, especially where available funding and infrastructure should have enabled a better level of population surveillance and service delivery. But it is also shattering because those deaths occurred in a place in these Isles where the injustice of preventable lost lives bears very profound importance. If people are disabled, not by physical or mental impairments, but by the social attitude and barriers they face in consequence of those impairments, then the politics of Northern Ireland, still too much defined by sectarian identity, is a socially disabling attitude and barrier in its own right. It does not allow for the human rights and equality of disabled people to be accounted for as much as they should be. It does not allow disabled people's perspective to be heard and seen as much as it must. In an inquiry module concerned with political and administrative decision-making, in a polity that because of its history and constitutional arrangements can find government decision-making difficult, our client is here to say that in Northern Ireland, disabled people count too. Starting with context, we make 5 points. First, even in normal times, let alone pandemic emergency, government was unstable. For, in fact, nearly 45% of the period since 1998, the people of Northern Ireland have not been politically governed by democratically accountable politicians. Instead, they have been administratively governed by reluctant civil servants whose powers are limited to maintaining services and institutions and not evolving them. Second, and as a consequence, governance was damaged. Brenda Doherty of the COVID-bereaved families has rightly pointed to a vacuum in governance. For disabled people, the vacuum meant that various initiatives to achieve greater equality and human rights have remained stuck, with each collapse of government effectively requiring the work to be started again. Third, resilience was compromised. In May 2020, the Health Minister, Robin Swan, made a speech reflecting that the political system in Northern Ireland had to look with humility at how it had undermined state capacity to cope with the pandemic. If there is soul searching to do, then the terrible exposure of the health and care system is where the searching must start. These are weaknesses that should have been factored into resilience planning, but were not. For disabled people, they underscore that the system of government was vulnerable and not them. Fourth, disabled people were peripheral, by which we mean that in Northern Ireland, as across the UK, disabled people faced pre-pandemic structural discrimination from both state and wider society, but we are saying more. That the 1998 settlement has frustrated the civil rights of disabled people. that in a very real sense, they are not seen and not heard because other networks and communities enjoy a special political status. And if disabled people cannot use those networks, their issues do not count as others do. Fifth, in this context, human rights are essential, but it is important to underscore the contradictions. On the one hand, human rights are integral to the peace process. They are written into the Good Friday Agreement, the Northern Ireland Act and the Northern Ireland Protocol. On the other hand, Northern Ireland does not enjoy a progressive human rights culture. Disabled people are not protected as they would be under the Equality Act 2010. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is hardly recognised or implemented in Northern Ireland at all. The social model of disability, ascribing disability to social forces rather than individual medical deficits, forms no part of policy. The state's discharge of positive obligations of consultation, data collection and emergency planning in accordance with the rights of disabled people is minimal. Turning then to pandemic decision-making, it is undeniable that renewed ministerial government after 3 years of no governing and with many novice ministers was not sufficiently robust or integrated to deal with a crisis of this kind. The deeper structural problem is that this is not a system of government capable of delivering anything other than lowest common denominator policies and decisions. That is because a five-party forced coalition of ministers determined and dominated by unionist Republican divisions cannot agree on anything else. For all the bureaucratic challenges that the inquiry has seen elsewhere, in Belfast you will study a civil service that at the best of times acts as a broker and mediator rather than policy builder, and which was found by the Renewable Heat Incentive Inquiry report in March 2020 to be seriously incompetent at delivering, quote, novel, technically complex and potentially volatile projects, not least due to, quote, lack of resources and of people with the specialist skills to ensure that the scheme was robustly designed and monitored. Those findings are relevant to this inquiry because where such shortcomings really mattered was in complex projects of emergency response. And we know from the disclosure, for instance, that the civil contingency arrangements had not been properly renewed for 20 years. All of this led to a failure of surge preparedness across all public authorities. Until well into March 2020, the virus was treated as a public health threat, with work essentially limited to the Department of Health. This confinement of the crisis to the health portfolio was all the more problematic because Northern Ireland has a department-led machinery of government. There is no cabinet government. It is siloisation by design. Those constitutional arrangements had direct implications for disabled people because there was insufficient planning, structures or expertise to consider the disabling effects of the virus and its countermeasures. The Department of Health Emergency Response Strategy of the 30th of March had no work stream on social vulnerability. Its strategic aim 7 was titled Wider Health/Economic Impact of Control Measures, but there was no mention of anything to do with disabled people. The Executive Office's 6 work streams had only a broad heading of number 3, societal and community well-being. As far as we can see, there was never a dedicated ministerial meeting on disabled people. The Department of Communities' awaited disability strategy, promised for 2021, remained and remains unpublished. Both of the government's experts say that non-medical issues were not looked at as much as health-related ones. No minister properly led on disabled people's issues. The Executive Office that had responsibility for equality as well as ministers in other departments all agree there was never the sufficient focus on vulnerable groups that there should have been. The result is that disabled people ended up being lost in pandemic decision-making, including the expert advice it relied upon. It was grounded in a standard medical model to which other public authorities in the system were apt to adhere. That is what Disability Action described as the tension in the approach of protecting vulnerable people during the Covid-19 crisis, whilst at the same time removing services for vulnerable people which had a detrimental impact upon their physical and mental health. They add, on the basis of their pandemic survey of some 1,700 people and connection to 300 local DPOs in Northern Ireland, that what became very clear was the feeling of many disabled people that their voices were being lost in the noise, or worse, simply ignored in the confusion and panic that was unfolding. This isolation of disabled people was compounded by being denied very basic participation in government decision-making. It cannot be emphasised enough how tokenistic the engagement with disabled people was in its own right, and when compared to the rest of the UK, especially the smaller nations. In Northern Ireland, co-production and co-design are just words. The anomaly here is that in politics and related religious and cultural identity, Northern Ireland is a place of extensive community networks, which in their interaction with the state have ultimately delivered and maintained peace. However, the monopoly of those networks is such that they block other networks and voices. The outcome is that the dignity and well-being of disabled people and other minorities cannot yet enjoy equal acknowledgement and participation in the post-conflict political landscape. The anomaly continues when it comes to data. For a nation blighted by profound structural discrimination in its recent past, Northern Ireland is unacceptably bad at collecting and using data. There were fundamental gaps in health and social care data. Deaths were not properly counted in real time. There was inability to disaggregate data by all 9 of the equality categories. There were then, as now, no published statistics detailing the number of disabled people resident in care homes. There has been no specific government piece of research investigating the impact of the pandemic on those living with disabilities. Improvement in data collection, distribution and analysis is characterised by the Northern Ireland Equality Commission as of itself a fundamental issue of equality. It is a post-conflict enigma that the Northern Irish state should be so disinterested in this issue. The consequence of siloed health department government, lack of meaningful engagement and poverty of data is that protection of disabled people during the pandemic was flawed. That was especially so with regard to shielding letters, access to food, inclusive communication, and with failure at executive level to render the issuing of DNR notices and the withdrawal of social care sufficiently accountable. The impact of Northern Irish government the incapacity of Northern Irish government to properly take into account disabled people's extended to COVID economics. Yes, funds were released from April 2020 to assist delivery of services and support to individuals at grassroots level. However, the criteria and method of redistribution are unclear. Without the proper funding of DPO to ensure co-production of policy and pandemic preparation, and without the involvement of disabled people in economic planning, any emergency financial response was bound to be reactive and protect the status quo. That was the case across the UK. But in Northern Ireland, the situation was aggravated by DPO not being sufficiently mainstreamed into the community pipelines to which such funding was released. My lady, going into the last of your government modules, the DPO are compelled to tell you that this is the place in the UK where in many ways disabled people are the most marginalised. There was no effective social partnership between the state and disabled people. Policy drives that take years to gain traction with any government have necessarily run aground incessantly. Gerald McGahey, the Chief Equality Commissioner, said in 2021 that equality protection in Northern Ireland is in the, quote, dark ages, in part because sectarian disputes have continued to dominate all else. Like others, we do not come to these hearings to criticise what power sharing has done to end violence, but it has not yet led to genuine pluralist politics or effective government. When the state's deep lack of resilience was exposed in a pandemic, it ended up violating the lives and well-being of disabled people. Not for the first time in British or Irish history, the failures of state therefore raise fundamental issues of humanity. In the unique and evolving context of post-conflict politics, it is important to ensure that the vulnerability of the Northern Ireland system is made sufficiently accountable and understood, and that the inquiry plays its part in exploring the possibilities of greater resilience and well-being of all of the people of this place into their futures. Thank you, my lady.
Very grateful, Mr. Freedman. Thank you very much. Mr. Jacobs, you next.
Good afternoon, my lady. This is the opening statement of the Trade Union Congress, the TUC, and the Northern Ireland Committee of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, the ICTU, or ICTU for short. The TUC and ICTU are separate organisations but with shared aims and values. ICTU is the largest civil society organisation on the island of Ireland, with 44 affiliated unions north and south of the border. The Northern Ireland Committee of ICTU is the representative body for 34 trade unions with over 200,000 members across Northern Ireland. I will refer in this open submission to ICTU, but in doing so I will be referring specifically to the work of the Northern Ireland Committee. This opening submission will highlight the unequal impact of COVID-19 in the workplace and address in outline some of the headline points as to some aspects of the government response to the pandemic, which contributed to those workplace impacts. But first, the unequal impact. It was a feature of the pandemic that many in frontline and essential roles who could not work from home were also in lower paid roles. They already suffered the structural health disadvantages associated with lower paid and insecure work. That included, of course, most visibly, many who worked in health and social care, but it also included those who kept transport systems going, who cleaned our public spaces, who worked in food processing, in manufacturing, and in many other roles. In respect of deaths from the virus and those of working age, the highest proportion in Northern Ireland, as in elsewhere in the UK, was amongst process plant and machine operatives. The impact is reflected not just in the numbers of working-age people who lost their lives to the virus, but also the consequences for the virus being seeded in the communities in which they lived. Deaths in the most deprived areas in Northern Ireland were significantly higher than those in the least deprived. So we join those who in the written evidence have expressed a debt of gratitude for the role played by the great many across a variety of sectors who kept Northern Ireland going during the pandemic. Of course, the real-world impacts of a pandemic upon public services are impossible to divorce from their state going into the pandemic. The context for this module is both austerity and the absence of a properly functioning government in the years prior. The need for reform of the health and social care system had been widely recognised, but any progress towards meaningful public sector reform was stalled by the collapse of the executive in 2017. The inquiry has already heard evidence as to the monumental healthcare waiting lists in Northern Ireland before the pandemic even began. Before this inquiry, Robin Swan gives a damning but accurate picture of the state of affairs going into the pandemic. He describes a period of healthcare surviving hand to mouth, resulting in short-term decisions instead of longer-term planning, and vital services being underfunded. He describes, again accurately, that social care was particularly neglected, with a lack of proper pay and career structures, leaving our care homes exposed. One means for a government to try and support the position of those at work is via social partnership. That is, an approach in which the government seeks to work collaboratively with stakeholder organisations such as unions, other sectoral representative organisations and employers. In Northern Ireland, the approach to social partnership in the pandemic was mixed. ICTU's attempts to meet with the joint office holders of the First and Deputy Minister often fell on deaf ears. With other ministers, such as the Minister of and senior officials within the Department of Health, there was much positive and constructive engagement. However, piecemeal social partnership was not sufficient to address the all-encompassing nature of the pandemic. The executive did engage via what was called the Strategic Engagement Forum, formed at the outset of the pandemic and which brought together employers, trade unions and statutory bodies including the Public Health Agency and the Health and Safety Executive for Northern Ireland. It first met on 30th of March 2020 and had as its core purpose to advise and support the executive in its commitment to containing the Covid-19 virus as it applies to the Northern Ireland economy and labour market. It was effective in that it prepared a list of key workers and essential businesses, established an emergency code of practice to assist businesses in complying with Covid-19 guidance, produced workplace safety guidance, and so on. The former Deputy First Minister describes it as one of the success stories of the pandemic. In a sense it was. The difficulty is the impression that after that initial and early engagement, it was largely ignored. We turn to enforcement of workplace safety. From early in the pandemic, Northern Ireland saw concerning mass outbreaks in workplaces amidst a picture of poor safety practices. There was significant concern as to the practical ability of the Health and Safety Executive of Northern Ireland, further to issues of capacity and resource, to monitor and enforce workplace safety. Unions called for unannounced inspections. Evidence has been provided to the inquiry by Louis Burns, the Deputy Chief Executive of Health and Safety Executive of Northern Ireland. But the picture is one of that organisation being reactive to concerns raised by others with limited follow-up action. Its response was limited to verbal and written communications, although it has no data system to record how many such communications were given. It is stated in terms that it would typically be for the complainant or a union rep to confirm whether the advised measures had been implemented. It was, realistically, left to unions or individual complainants to both raise concerns with the Health and Safety Executive of Northern Ireland and to follow up on whether any action had been taken. If there really is an interest in the unequal impact of the pandemic in the workplace, there must also be an interest in workplace safety. It may be a prosaic part of the solution, but it is ultimately a fundamentally important one. Another part of the solution is adequate financial support for those needing to self-isolate. Whilst many quite rightly benefited from job retention schemes, many lower-paid workers in higher-risk roles faced losing pay whilst needing to self-isolate. As stated by ICTU on the 18th of March 2020, quote, "The UK's statutory sick pay arrangements of £94 per week are totally insufficient and do not approach the financial reality of family life in the UK," end quote. It was not just a matter of hardship. The lack of adequate financial support for self-isolation was a powerful disincentive to it and will have placed an upward pressure on the spread of the virus, again particularly on communities already suffering socioeconomic and health disadvantages. It is now evident in material obtained by this inquiry that the Chief Medical Officer was raising the very same issue internally within government. Some analysis of the internal government machinations is within our lengthier written submission, but the picture generally is one of a lack of any determined action or even ownership of the issue. My lady, it is critical that in a future pandemic, plans are in place to properly support those required to self-isolate. Our final topic is the social care sector. Detailed consideration is, as you say, my lady, for a later module, but this module will no doubt touch on the political decision-making in respect of social care. In other modules, there has been a tendency of decision-makers in defending the history of events around discharge from hospital to social care and the terrible death rates in care homes to point to the role of transmission between and from staff in care homes being a relevant or even key factor. Inevitably, many working in social care, working under the most challenging and distressing of circumstances, contracted and passed the virus. They were working in a high-risk role, putting themselves and their families at risk. Of course, with a virus capable of asymptomatic transmission, staff unknowingly carrying the virus was both inevitable and foreseeable. In those circumstances, the key question is not whether staff carried the virus, but what steps were taken to address that issue in terms of effective infection prevention and control measures in the sector, practical steps to alleviate the need for workers to move between different care settings, and steps to ensure that workers were not in any way penalised by such measures. In conclusion, my lady, in considering and seeking to improve the effectiveness of the response to the next pandemic, there are structural problems which need to be addressed. There needs to be, quite basically, a functioning executive, and the long called for reforms to health and social care need to be translated into action. It is important for this inquiry to lay bare the impact of these matters on the Covid-19 pandemic, thereby, it is hoped, prompting action. It is the heavy responsibility of the Northern Ireland Government and civil society to take these matters forward. Building upon those foundations, pandemic preparedness and response needs to be focused on ameliorating the burden faced by those in low-paid, public-facing roles who, almost inevitably in a pandemic, face higher risks of contracting the virus against a background of poorer pre-existing health outcomes. That should include better consultation with stakeholders that bring knowledge to the government on these issues, better workplace safety contributed to by better enforcement, and better support for self-isolation. My lady, those are my submissions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Jacobs. Ms Annie-Deaky-Daines. Are you switched on? Need a green light.
I am now. Thank you very much indeed, my lady, and for giving me the opportunity to make these opening submissions. Your ladyship will remember that we made opening submissions right at the start of this module, and we provided written submissions, and we have indeed provided written submissions too on this occasion. So I'm not going to repeat any of that because I don't see how that could be helpful to your ladyship. The written submissions, the longer version that we did provide, dealt with some very specific concerns that the Commissioner has, including the contradiction in the government's response, the failures in communications, ageism and discrimination. And the Commissioner comes to that as Commissioner for Older People in Northern Ireland, with an office established by the Commissioner for Older People's Act in 2011, with the principal aim of safeguarding and promoting the interests of older people in Northern Ireland. And that is a group which, as at the last census in 2021, represents approximately 23% of the total population. And for those purposes, that is older people being aged 60 and upwards. And that group is not only projected to rise, but to rise at a higher rate than the overall population of Northern Ireland. My lady, out of those specific concerns which the Commissioner raised in his written submission, I want to just highlight a few matters without repeating what is said in those written submissions. And those are, firstly, the issue of numbers, which some have already addressed in their opening submissions. Secondly, the issue of planning and decision-making, another issue featuring in others' opening submissions. And then thirdly, making the most of the knowledge base before going into the Commissioner's hopes for this part of the inquiry. So, on the numbers, the Commissioner would like to highlight the disproportionate adverse impact of COVID-19 on the population of older people. It's generally accepted that the pandemic was devastating for older people, and the Minister for Health, Robin Swan's acknowledgement of that is commonly cited. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a huge impact on older people. 90% of COVID-19 deaths in the first wave of the pandemic were in people aged over 65, and around half of COVID-19 deaths in Northern Ireland occurred in a care home. And the fact that it is often recited doesn't stop it from being a nonetheless shocking statistic. And your ladyship will be aware that we're dealing with those over the age of 65. If one was to take that to those over the age of 60, that of course increases. And there will be those either in this room or following the proceedings whose loved ones form a part of that awful statistic. And that also is simply a reference to the first wave. So we all know it didn't end there. The statistics show that from the 19th of March 2020 to the 14th of October 2022, which is roughly the period covered by this module, there were 4,892 COVID-19 related deaths in Northern Ireland, and most of them were amongst older people or involved older people. Furthermore, by the 19th of February 2021 alone, about a third of the way through that period, there had been 983 deaths of care home residents. And the overwhelming majority of them died in the care home itself and not in hospital. And not only are those truly awful statistics, but they may not portray the full extent of the pandemic's impact. And this is due to the way in which the figures were collected, the criteria that applied to a COVID-19 death, coupled with the approach to testing during the pandemic, so that whether you actually knew whether you were dealing with a COVID-19 death, and the recording of deaths in care homes. And the upshot of all of that is it remains still unclear how many older people died of COVID-19 during the pandemic. And it's also unclear how many older people died of conditions for which they were unable to obtain treatment due to the focus of the scarce NHS resources on dealing with the pandemic, or saw their conditions considerably worsen. From the outset, the Commissioner advocated for accurate recording and publication of COVID-19 related deaths, and he hopes that this is a matter that can be addressed during this inquiry, because it's obvious. If you don't have accurate and relevant information, you can't plan effectively. And that's the next point that the Commissioner would like to highlight. Planning and decision-making. Detailed information on the need for structural reform in Northern Ireland for the delivery of health and social care services was available to the government before the pandemic. And your ladyship will be aware of the 2016 Bengoa report, and COPNI itself, which is the Commissioner's Office, provided 3 reports. One in 2014, Changing the Culture of Care Provision in Northern Ireland. Then another, the following year, 2015, Prepared to Care, Modernising Adult Social Care in Northern Ireland. And then a third in 2017, the CMA Care Homes Market Study. So the need for reform was well known before the pandemic. It was also well known that the reform did not take place, or at least not sufficiently. And it might be reasonable to consider that in those circumstances, there should have been some level of planning about how Northern Ireland would respond to a pandemic with its structures in its yet unreformed state. It might be reasonable to consider that the structural issues and resource deficits should have been factored into decision-making and inform the extent to which responses to the pandemic from other UK jurisdictions with different structures would be appropriate to follow in Northern Ireland. More particularly from the perspective of older people, the known reliance on largely privately owned care homes contracted to the Health and Social Care Trusts to deliver social care to older people through placement packages should have informed decision-making on the pandemic. And the Commissioner is concerned that this was not reflected into critical decisions about hospital discharge, testing, vaccinating, and especially in the context of lockdowns that would necessarily create a closed, vulnerable community of older people. The Commissioner is concerned about the possibility of the decision-making that impacted most adversely on older people was not just the result of poor planning and a failure to engage with the realities of the structures and resources as they existed at the time, but betrayed a degree of ageist prejudices. The type of view subsequently revealed in Sir Patrick Vallance's diaries with reference to Prime Minister Boris Johnson that older people should be accepting their fate and letting younger people get on with their lives during the pandemic, and that COVID's just nature's way of dealing with old people, and I'm not entirely sure I disagree with them. That sort of thinking is a real concern, the extent to which, maybe not at those extreme levels, but did nonetheless influence the way the policies were being formed. The Commissioner does not believe that government properly appreciated the impact on older people, and a real fear was allowed to develop amongst older people and their families that age was being used as a criterion for making those decisions, rather than a clinical requirement such as a person's capacity to benefit from admission and treatment. And all of this might have been anticipated and better steps taken to address those fears, especially when the media began to report about older people being pressurised into signing do not attempt CPR forms. How all this may have translated into the high mortality and morbidity rates for older people is a matter that may well emerge in the hearing, and it will be a matter for the inquiry to determine whether there is any evidence of direct or indirect age discrimination in the government's response to the pandemic in Northern Ireland. But it is certainly a concern amongst the older people that the Commissioner represents. Then to the making the most of the knowledge base. The final issue that the Commissioner would like to raise is the extent to which the government failed to tap into the knowledge and expertise of stakeholders to inform the development of policy and assist with the formulation of effective guidance. This was particularly regrettable in relation to older people who were known to be a vulnerable group and where there were those who could have provided constructive and informed commentary on the likely difficulties with implementation or even possible unintended consequences of the government's plans. And one example may make the point. There are some 473 residential care homes catering for older people in Northern Ireland through about 11,400 care packages, not including those for domiciliary care, which simply increase that. And the significance of this service sector to the formulation and implementation of guidance to control the impact of the pandemic on older people should have been obvious to the government from the outset. Yet in many instances, there was an inexplicable failure to engage with it, to harness its expertise and improve the formulation of policy, as well as to explain how the new regulations were intended to operate to maximise their effectiveness. So, my lady, just to conclude on the objectives that the Commissioner has for the inquiry, what he hopes is for the results what he hopes from these oral hearings is that those sheer numbers of people who suffered or died, that there can be some proper examination and explanation of how on earth that could have happened. He would like, for everybody, a clear understanding of what went wrong and why it did, and the extent to which, with better planning, something like that in the future might be avoided. He is strongly of the view that despite the experience from the exercise sickness to to assess the UK's preparedness and response to a flu pandemic outbreak, and all the modelling talent and epidemiological expertise available to the government, it failed in its most basic task to ensure that the people would be as safe as possible from the impact of a pandemic. And a high price was paid for that failure by older people and those professionals and family who cared for them. Many older people who did not die during the pandemic nonetheless suffered considerably during lockdown and the repeated periods of isolation imposed by their care homes or the need to shield in their own homes. Residents in care homes were frequently restricted to their own room, denied the opportunity to socialise with other residents who lived under the same roof, and this lack of social contact frequently led to a deterioration in physical health and often brought about a decline in mental health. And for some of those whose mental powers were already in decline, the opportunity to have any appreciable contact with someone they recognised was lost before that contact could be reinstated. And for others who were in the end stage of their lives, the absence of their family and friends and limited physical interaction with care staff meant that this precious end-of-life period frequently had very little quality. The Commissioner sincerely hopes that this inquiry, having laid bare what happened and made recommendations as to how to minimise the likelihood of that happening again, that there is a positive response from government to that. He is aware that many older people fear that if there were to be another pandemic in the next few years, as could happen, not enough will have changed to ensure that there is a much better outcome for them. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed for your help. Mr. Phillips, I think you're next.
Yes, lady, as you know, I appear on behalf of the National Police Chiefs Council, which is a national coordinating body representing all UK police forces. The NPCC is also a core participant, again, you know, in modules 1, 2, 2A and 2B, and it's worked to assist the inquiry at each stage of its proceedings. In module 2C, the NPCC represents the interests of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the PSNI. The PSNI, along with police services throughout the UK, were one of the frontline services dealing with the day-to-day impacts of the pandemic on members of the public and on local communities. They undertook that work whilst, of course, also dealing with the impact of the pandemic on the police workforce and on normal policing activity, as well as on their own families and households. Lady, in Module 2, you heard evidence from Martin Hewitt, who was the chair of the NPCC throughout the pandemic. In this module, you'll hear from former Assistant Chief Constable Alan Todd. Mr. Todd, who retired last summer, led the policing response to the pandemic in Northern Ireland. And that was itself part of the national policing response led by the NPCC, Operation Tala. As with the Module 2, 2A and 2B hearings, it's clear that the principal focus of these hearings will be on high-level decision-making and political governance in Northern Ireland. And again, in the list of issues for this module, there is understandably very little concerning police work. The inquiry's focus in that area seems to be once more on the question of the enforcement of the COVID regulations. Well, lady, as you heard in Module 2, Operation Tala coordinated a far broader range of work over the course of the pandemic than just enforcing the restrictions. The many portfolios of Operation Tala here in Northern Ireland included the critical task of maintaining a workforce, providing core policing functions, supporting the criminal justice system, liaising with government, establishing procedures for the collation and analysis of COVID-19 data, procuring PPE, and delivering and training staff in its use. As you know, lady, the pandemic created challenges in every aspect of public and private life. Police officers and their leaders had to adjust to novel conditions without any idea of how long they would last or how long police resources would be diminished through isolation or infection. PSNI officers, like other police officers in the UK, did what they could to continue to discharge their usual duties and functions while paying proper regard to the safety and welfare of their own staff and officers. However, milady, this is perhaps the right moment to acknowledge that, of course, policing in Northern Ireland is different. The context is different. The historical background is different. I don't want to labour the point, nor spend any time now setting out the history or the detail. I shall take it as well understood by you and by the inquiry. That context, however, obviously added another layer of complexity to the difficult business of police work during the pandemic. Lady, you've heard evidence about the central importance of the NPCC's 4 E's guidance for achieving compliance with the regulations: engage, explain, encourage, enforce. Northern Ireland, along with the rest of the UK, adopted this policing approach in March 2020. And throughout the pandemic, the consistent messaging, both to the public and within the PSNI, was that enforcement remained the last resort, to be used only when the first 3 E's had been exhausted. The task faced by the police here, as in the rest of the UK, was to encourage the public to comply with regulations which were judged by government to be in everyone's best interests and had been designed for their protection, whilst at the same time maintaining public safety and, above all, public confidence. That was a formidable assignment throughout the UK, and for the reasons I've mentioned, an even more difficult challenge here. In Module 2, Martin Hewitt explained to you that it was compliance and not enforcement that there was a true measure of success in respect of police engagement with the public. And as he noted, in a public health context, it's compliance which prevents transmission and keeps the community and indeed the police safe. And in my closing submissions for Module 2, I made the point to you, which with respect I repeat now, that when it comes to the enforcement of the COVID regulations, the police response to the pandemic cannot fairly be assessed solely by reference to the number of fixed penalty notices issued, because that omits all the encounters which successfully achieved compliance short of that 4th E. And so it is, I hope, worth reminding you that the overwhelming majority of police engagements began and ended with the first 3 E's. Lady, on the question of the 4th E, enforcement, the PSNI has provided the inquiry with the full data as to the number, the level of fines issued to members of the public during the pandemic. In Northern Ireland, the PSNI were the enforcing authority for the Covid-19 regulations, but also, unlike police forces in England and Wales, were responsible for issuing the fixed penalty notices directly to members of the public. However, recognising the importance of ensuring consistency and fairness in their approach, the PSNI added an extra layer of authorisation to the enforcement procedures for FPNs issued under the COVID regulations, and that required officers to seek approval from a silver commander in the Strategic Coordination Centre before issuing an FPN. Each FPN issued was then recorded centrally, along with the other disposal methods, such as, for example, community resolution notices. Mr. Todd analysed this data every day to ensure a consistent and fair approach. He provided summaries to government officials, to ministers, and to the Chief Medical Officer to assist with their understanding of compliance and to inform decision-making. More generally, the PSNI worked closely with the government in Northern Ireland throughout the pandemic. It was a collaborative and constructive relationship with frank exchanges when there were, for example, concerns about the clarity and enforceability of the rules. Lady, I'd like finally to stress that throughout the pandemic, the PSNI shared with the Executive the same aims, namely to prevent transmission and to keep the public safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Phillips. Ms. Monahan.
My Lady, I appear on behalf of the Department of Health in Northern Ireland. By this opening statement, the Department again wishes to take the opportunity to express its profound condolences to the families and friends of everyone who died due to Covid-19. It should be understood that at all times during the pandemic, the Department's overriding priority was to minimise the loss of life. The loss of life and the individuals and the families involved must remain at the forefront of everyone's thoughts throughout this inquiry. This is also an opportune moment to again praise the bravery, commitment and professionalism of health and social care workers across Northern Ireland. Quite properly, much, my Lady, has been made of the unprecedented challenges that Covid-19 brought to bear on governments and on policymakers. However, it must not be forgotten that the most acute pressures were experienced on the front line. That has been said before, my Lady, but it bears repetition. This opening statement will confine itself to some overarching comments about the Department's response to Covid-19, given that in this module, the inquiry will focus on vital decisions which were made at pace during the biggest public health crisis of all of our lifetimes. The examination by this inquiry can be expected to bring to light tensions which will inevitably have developed over the best approach that should have been taken. The Department is, of course, fully supportive of the inquiry process and stands ready to learn any lessons whatsoever, however painful these may be. It must also be said that Covid-19 brought unparalleled pressures for governments across the world. The inquiry will be mindful that the pandemic represented a baptism of fire for our fledgling five-party coalition, which was heading a devolved administration in a relatively small part of the UK. My Lady, you will be well aware of the limitations faced by all policymakers at this time, with immediate decisions that had to be made in an environment of severe global uncertainty and incomplete information. The Department would also emphasise that all too often the task was not to make the right decision, but to make the least wrong one. Near impossible choices were required. Throughout the pandemic, the Department has been very mindful of the consequences, including the health consequences, of decisions made on issues such as school closures and the shutdown of large swathes of the economy. This Department remains convinced, however, given the prevailing circumstances, that the lockdown and the other non-pharmaceutical interventions were the best available option at key junctures. But it also acknowledges that these measures came at a heavy cost and that all decision makers had to grapple with truly awful dilemmas. The inquiry has quite properly been examining the impact of political instability in Northern Ireland in relation to pandemic preparedness. It was, of course, far from ideal, to say the least, that Northern Ireland had been without an executive for some 3 years prior to 2020. Moreover, Northern Ireland's health service was in many key respects the most fragile of the 4 UK nations at the time when Covid-19 arrived on our shores. Moreover, this should not lead inexorably to the conclusion that Northern Ireland's response to Covid-19 was an outlier in UK government terms, or indeed was the sick man of the kingdom. In that respect, the Department concurs with the analysis of Professor Hale in his report, as referenced this morning by counsel to the inquiry in her opening statement. As my lady will be aware, Professor Hale was instructed by the inquiry to analyse the effectiveness of decision-making in the UK and of each devolved administration. in respect of the COVID-19 pandemic in comparison with other countries. In the course of his detailed assessment, Professor Hale noted that in comparison, Northern Ireland fared better than all other parts of the UK in terms of the pandemic's impact, in that its deaths were ranked 34th in Europe. Of course, the Department also acknowledges that there will be multiple and complex causal factors behind these statistics, and that simplistic interpretations must be avoided. We also, I would say, guard against any complacency. Additionally, it is essential, of course, to be constantly reminded that behind every single COVID fatality statistic, it is an individual whose life was cut short, who has left behind grief-stricken relatives and friends. I would also draw the inquiry's attention to the report it commissioned from Professor Anne-Marie Gray and Professor Carl O'Connor. That report included the telling observation that during the pandemic, too much pressure was placed on one department, that of health. It may be that history is now inevitably repeating itself in that regard. Northern Ireland was tested as never before by COVID-19. The virus could have been a public health crisis too far for a new administration and the society that it serves. The Department of Health maintains that the local community, and not least the health service and other public servants, met the challenges of the pandemic with resolve, dexterity, compassion and solidarity. There are, of course, key questions to answer, inevitable shortcomings to be examined, and multiple what-ifs. That is why we are all here. However, the scale of the COVID response which was deployed should be recognised, along with the countless hours of work and the all too many agonising dilemmas which were forced upon those making decisions. The Department has already today paid tribute to our health and social care workers, but we would also wish to praise the wider community across Northern Ireland and its response to the pandemic. The unparalleled sacrifices that were made across society should not go unheralded. Lives were put on hold for extended periods to protect the vulnerable and safeguard the health service. And for that, my lady, the Department wishes to thank them all. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Lanahan. Mr Cole.
Wearing the furniture. Thank you, Milady. Milady, I appear on behalf of the Executive Office, which is also known by its short form as TEO. So the TEO welcomes the work of the inquiry, and in particular, as the inquiry turns its focus to this module looking at governmental decision-making in Northern Ireland relating to the COVID-19 pandemic between early January 2020 and March 2022. At the outset of this module, TEO wishes to again acknowledge the impact the pandemic and the management of the pandemic had and continues to have on the people of Northern Ireland. TEO offers its sincere and heartfelt condolences to the family and friends of all those who died in the pandemic, often in terrible circumstances, and its sympathies to all of those who were affected by COVID-19 and the measures introduced to address the public health risks that it brought to our community. TEO recognises the very real impact that those measures had on very many in Northern Irish society, on how they were able to engage in the normal interactions of life, the isolation and loneliness experienced by many, and the widespread enduring impact continuing to be felt today by our community, particularly by our elderly and vulnerable groups. And can I say, Milady, that in relation to the experience video that we saw today, nobody watching that video could be otherwise than deeply and genuinely affected by the stories of loss, devastation, isolation that they describe. One is mindful also that that video is but a snapshot or a vignette of a much wider, widespread reality still being experienced in Northern Ireland today. It goes very starkly to underline the significance of the work of the inquiry and indeed the importance of the participation of those so terribly affected by the pandemic in the work of the inquiry. It is not the intention, by the way, of this opening statement to enter into detailed submissions, nor indeed at this stage to put forward any contentions or arguments as to what the evidence to the inquiry demonstrates in respect of TU's role in the decision-making relevant to the issues in this module. It is, however, apt to take the opportunity to set out perhaps some essential aspects in brief detail of the surrounding context. Module 2C comes at the end, obviously, of a series of modules in respect of governance and decision-making processes across different parts of the United Kingdom. As appears from the outline of scope, the inquiry will wish to carefully consider and take account of the bespoke arrangements of government in Northern Ireland. And indeed, that is obvious from my learned friend Ms Dobbin's opening to you earlier today. Those arrangements have, of course, been endorsed by the people of Northern Ireland to reflect the need to ensure broad cross-community support and participation in the structures of government here in a post-conflict society. Put simply, Northern Ireland is different and unique. It is hoped that the statements from TEO witnesses, and particularly the TEO corporate statement, has been of assistance to the inquiry in that regard. As referenced already, this opening statement is not the appropriate means to engage on this issue in full detail. It is perhaps suffice for the moment to note the following. The constitutional arrangements in Northern Ireland stem from the Good Friday Agreement. For current purposes, possibly the most significant difference between Northern Ireland and the other parts of the United Kingdom in terms of governance is the particular construction of the Northern Ireland Executive Committee, operating as a mandatory coalition. The Executive, as you've heard, is made up of 10 ministers across 9 departments, the First and Deputy First Minister holding joint office. Each minister, in general terms, has executive authority to determine policy and operational matters within their department, subject to the requirement that certain matters, in summary for current purposes, cross-cutting or significant or controversial, will be referred to the executive for decision. Those particular high-level constitutional arrangements have resonant implications for the structure and operation of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, which, of course, it must be remembered, is an entirely distinct operation from the Home Civil Service in Great Britain. Each of the departments in the Northern Ireland Civil Service is a separate legal entity. The minister in each department is the head of that department, and the department is subject to his or her direction and control. The permanent secretary in each department is accountable to that department's minister. As a consequence, the civil service here does not operate in what might be described as a hierarchical or command and control type fashion. That might be the experience elsewhere, but it is not the fit here. TEO and indeed the head of the civil service here do not exercise day-to-day management and control of the other departments. And under the arrangements in place, the head of the civil service does not have the power to direct the permanent secretaries of other departments in the exercise of their functions. Essentially, the role of the head of the civil service is threefold: principal policy advisor to the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, secretary to the Executive Committee, and head of the civil service and of the some 23,000 civil servants in Northern Ireland led by individual permanent secretaries. It must, of course, be recognised that frontline staff in both the public and private sectors providing essential services to the public were dealing during the pandemic with the most difficult and unprecedented of circumstances. Alongside this, TEO recognises that as part of the surrounding context for this module, those involved in the development of policy and indeed in the decision-making processes were doing so in testing and pressurised conditions, again in unprecedented and highly complex situation. Northern Ireland is, as you've heard and as you know, a relatively small jurisdiction. The civil service has to operate within a complex political environment and with ongoing and constant financial pressures. It's the TEO's position that people were doing their best with the intention of serving the interests of the people of Northern Ireland. TEO, like other government departments across the UK and wider afield, was operating in this unprecedented situation, responding to a global pandemic, and often required to provide advice and guidance to ministers at pace. In addition, it will not have escaped the inquiry's attention that TEO was dealing with other issues, not least the implications in Northern Ireland of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. It's anticipated from TEO's perspective that among the issues that the inquiry will be particularly interested in examining in this module will be the impact of the absence of ministers for the 3 years prior to January 2020. And of course, it will be noted that the period under examination in this module is effectively bookended by periods of no executive being in place from January 17 to January 20, and then from February 22 to February 24 this year. It's also anticipated that the inquiry will look carefully at equality considerations, resourcing levels in civil contingencies function, delayed pandemic flu planning, and of course informal communications and retention of information. It is acknowledged by TEO that in its preparedness for and in its addressing of the pandemic, there will have been matters that could have been done differently and should have been done better. TEO welcomes the important work of the inquiry in identifying those areas and acknowledges that alongside this, the pandemic continues to have a profound impact on the people of Northern Ireland. Throughout the inquiry, and as will continue in this module, TEO have listened in order to learn from the work of the inquiry and to do things better in the future. Those are my submissions for the moment, Lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Cole. I think that completes the oral opening submissions. I'm very grateful to everyone for not only the quality of their submissions, but also the timeliness. I think we have 2 witnesses to start this afternoon.
I think we're going to have a break first, though, for 10 minutes.
So I shall return at 3:10 and we'll begin hearing the evidence. Thank you.
All right.
Are we a little early? Just thinking about people online, that's all. We can do the oath.
Thank you. Well, my lady, may I call the first witness, please, in Module 2C?
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Hope you haven't felt you've had to wait a long time to get to this stage.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
My name's Marion Reynolds.
And thank you for providing a witness statement to the inquiry. I think you have that in front of you, don't you?
I have.
And I think if you just look at the very back of it, I think you signed it on the 26th of February 2024, is that right?
That's correct.
And are you happy for that evidence to stand as your evidence in this inquiry?
I am, my lady.
And is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Okay. Now, I think you've already sent a message saying that I need to keep my voice up. So I'll do my best to do that. But if at any point you can't hear me, please just say. Okay? Okay. Now, I think it's right, Miss Reynolds, that you're here to give evidence on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID-bereaved Families for Justice, and also in your own right as well to talk about your experiences. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And I'm just going to ask you maybe a bit about yourself before I move on to do that. Could you tell the inquiry a little bit about your professional experience? I think you had a long career in social care, is that right?
That's correct. My lady, I started life off as a family and childcare social worker and moved through that into management. And then in 1992, I moved to the Department of Health as a social services inspector, inspecting children's facilities and also providing policy advice on children's social services. I left the department in December 2005 to join the Eastern Board as the Deputy Director of Family and Childcare Services, and I remained there until September of 2009, when I left because of the review of public administration. And for 13 years after that, I worked as an independent social work consultant.
And Ms Reynolds, do you think that background was helpful to you, as it were, in navigating the care of your aunt, which we'll come to very shortly?
Well, technically it should have, in the sense that I knew the system very well. And not only did I know the system, but I knew a lot of the people personally, that I'd worked with them over my professional life. But it didn't really make any difference to my ability to effect change or to get the sort of service for my aunt that I thought she needed.
All right. And do you think that your background meant that you approached the care of your aunt with a degree of realism or an understanding of how systems work in reality in terms of care and...
Well, I would have been... I'm a bit of a pragmatist anyway, so I knew what my aunt's needs were, and up until she fractured her hip, she lived independently in the community. She required some support, and that was provided through a lady that we bought private care from, and also myself going down twice a week. So I knew her situation very well. I knew her personality. I knew what she liked and what she didn't like. And I knew what she would do and what she wouldn't do. And when my aunt didn't want to do something, she wouldn't do it. Simple as that. 5'0" and a will of steel. And that was her. And she had, because she was profoundly deaf, and she lip read. And she was very proficient at that. And so when COVID started, and she had carers coming in after she fractured her hip, and they were wearing masks, she couldn't lip read. And she kept saying to them, take your mask off, take your mask off. And of course they couldn't, because they were required to wear the mask. So then when she went into hospital...
Ms Reynolds, I'm just sorry, forgive me, I'm just going to stop you there, because you've just jumped ahead a wee bit in time, and I just wanted to make sure I'd introduced this properly, just about what happened to Mary, and I hope you don't mind. Is it all right to call her Mary when
Yes,
I'm asking you questions? So I think it's right, and I think, as you've just said, in March 2020 she hurt her hip, and she ended up in hospital. And I think, as you've said, there were concerns then about her ability to communicate with people because of the fact of wearing masks and the lack of mitigation around that. Is that right?
Yes. Well, I think at that stage we were allowed to visit. So it wasn't so bad because we were able to go in and out.
Yes.
And it was just over time the visiting became more curtailed, and that became a problem. Because my aunt had a long-standing eating problem. Now, this is not a problem of old age. This was the whole way through her life. She needed to know who made the food, who handled the food. And so when we were able to get in every day, we were able to bring food and to make sure she had nourishment. As the COVID pandemic continued, the amount of contact we were allowed reduced from daily to once a week and then stopped completely. So we had no mechanism to go in and to make sure she got nourishment or that she was getting liquids. And that was a source of concern. And when we phoned either the hospital or the care home, they all told us that they couldn't get her to eat they couldn't get her to take her tablets. And I kept saying, well, look, I'm happy to go down, and she will eat with encouragement if we're there, because I would have been bringing food and she'd have been happy about that. But that was never accepted as as a possibility.
And I'm just going to stop you there, because I think it's right that Mary, after she was in hospital, did she go home for a bit?
She did. She was in the hospital. She had her hip fracture repaired. Then she went for rehabilitation and she got home. And when she got home, she was on a package of carers 4 times a day. And my brother and I took turns to stay overnight with her, really to try and get her back into living independently in the community. And the lady that we had previously paid to go in to help, she augmented that. So we were quite satisfied that she was getting the level of care that she needed. So unfortunately, she then took pneumonia in September.
Yes.
And the GP had her admitted to hospital. And then when she was in hospital at that stage, a few days, or maybe 5 days after she was admitted, they phoned me to say she'd tested positive for COVID.
Yes.
Now, she hadn't COVID when she was admitted, but she did have a pneumonia. She recovered from that, and then, do you want me to go on this story?
Well, so I think the next thing that happened then to Mary was that the hospital wanted to discharge her home. Is that right?
Yeah.
Although she was in quite a weak condition.
Yeah, well, I got a phone call from the senior social worker saying to me they were going to discharge Auntie Mary that day. Now, at that time, I myself had COVID, and I really wasn't very well. And I said, no, she can't go home because I'm not there to augment the care, and the carers 4 times a day would be insufficient to manage her needs. And the social worker was insistent, and I said, well, look, I have the keys of her house. And she said, it's all right, we'll get a locksmith and open the house up to discharge her to it. And I said, my aunt's house is my house. I bought it for her when she wanted to move to Bangor. I said, so you can't change the locks? And she said, well, are you prepared to tell your aunt that you won't let her go home? And I said, I'm more than happy to do that, because my aunt would know I wouldn't do anything that wasn't for her good. So at that stage...
Just take your time.
The social worker then backed down. Now, if I hadn't been ill, I would have reported her to NIS, because I thought her attitude was uncaring. She wasn't putting my aunt's needs first. And I thought it was really quite cruel. And she told me that this other elderly gentleman in the same position as my aunt had been discharged. And I said, well, he's not my responsibility, but my aunt is. So that night, now it was a winter's night, it was raining, it was bitterly cold, and they transferred my aunt from the Ulster Hospital to the Down Hospital. Now, whether I'm right or not, I don't know, but I felt it was punitive in the sense that I had stood up to them and said, she's not going home, and that's the end of it. And now, this could be me just being absolutely paranoid, and I accept that. But to transfer an elderly lady late into the night, if not into the early hours of in the morning, in a cold, wet winter's night, I thought was unnecessary, unkind, and really said very little about the compassion that was given to my aunt.
No, I think it's right that after that, so Mary went to another hospital, and then she was transferred to a care home, wasn't she?
Yes, I was never allowed to see her in that hospital at all.
Yes.
And I did go down and talk to the social worker, and we were trying to get her into, because she needed some rehabilitation more than could be provided at home. So we're trying to get her into a care home. which was a very small care home that we would have been happy with for a short period of time. So what happened was she then phoned me and said, your aunt isn't being discharged to that care home. She has to be discharged to Cumber Care Home because she tested positive for COVID within 28 days. And I said, it must be very close on the 28 days. And she said it was 27 days. So she was transferred to this care home that had a wing for COVID patients. And I wasn't allowed to see her there either. Despite my best efforts. Now, when my aunt was in hospital, I was making phone calls to different people to try and see her. It wasn't that I only started when she went into the care home, but when she was in the Down Hospital, I was trying. So when she went to the Cumber Care Home, we phoned every day, and every day we got the message, she's not eating and she's not taking her tablets. And every day we were saying, look, one of us is happy to go down and help, but we were never allowed.
And I think, Ms Reynolds, you said that at some stage you realised that maybe other people were being allowed visits, but you couldn't quite understand why that wouldn't apply to you.
Well, one day when I was going down, there was a lady, just when I parked my car, this lady got out and she walked into the front door of the home. Now, we weren't allowed to go to the front door of the home. We had to go round to the window and do window visits. So one of the staff was coming out and I heard her greet the lady by her name. And she said to her, oh, just go on up. So I thought, she must be allowed a visit. Why am I not allowed a visit? Well, coincidentally with that, one of the staff at the Down Lisburn Trust had told me about Care Partners. And that was the first I'd heard of that. Now, Care Partners came out in September. I was always entitled to see my aunt in that care home, and they never informed me of my right. Now, that meant that for the last number of weeks of my aunt's life, there could have been a family visit, and she never was given it.
So I think what you've said in your statement, Miss Reynolds, was that you could see your Aunt Mary through the window, but you weren't allowed.
No, and one of the Department of Health provided additional funding to care homes to enable them to make provision for families to visit. Now, my aunt's younger sister, who was 86, I would have taken her with me sometimes to visit. And we had to go to a window to visit. And outside, they hadn't even put a paving stone down. We had to stand on wet grass. Now, to me, a paving stone is a minimal cost. They were provided with significant resources to facilitate family visits, and they weren't used. And Auntie Mary, when we would be at window visits, she was in the bed, which is at the opposite side of the room. She could see us. She couldn't hear what we were saying, and she kept waving to us to come in. And we were busy saying, no, we're not allowed, we're not allowed. But in fact, we would have been allowed if they had implemented the guidance. And I mean, I'm sure she couldn't understand, why are these pair out in this window in November and not getting in? And I mean, why, when there was guidance that would have let us in?
And I think, is it right that you did eventually get to see her at some point?
Yes.
You were allowed in. And can you just tell us then how you found her, Miss Reynolds, when you did get to see her?
Well, when I got in to see her, she was lying in bed with clothes on that weren't her clothes. Now, my aunt was a very snappy, fussy dresser, and these clothes that she was wearing didn't even fit. But anyhow, her clothes were in a cupboard in the plastic bags that she'd been discharged from hospital with. She was very dehydrated. I had brought a flask of tea and some sandwiches with me. And when she drank, she couldn't talk to me when I first arrived, but once I gave her the tea, she was hydrated and we had a conversation.
Yes.
And I mean, in my opinion, I wouldn't have seen many people die, to be honest with you. But people working in care homes would have. They must have been in a better position than I ever would have been to judge that my aunt was nearing the end of her life. And I mean, I just felt the care, it had become, individuals were treated as objects of concern rather than as people with needs. It's individuals with their own unique way of living. And I felt that was lost.
And I think, Ms. Reynolds, what you say in your statement is that after your Aunt Mary died, there was a number of other concerns that you had, and one of those was around the certification of her death.
Yes,
is that correct?
Well, when my aunt died, I phoned it. My aunt had already arranged much of her funeral herself. She had told me which undertaker she had wanted to go to. She had prepared a funeral service. The only thing that needed to be filled in was her date of death. And she told me, if you tell them my date of birth, I'll come back and haunt you. She would never tell anyone her age. But so she had on just to put in her date of death. So when I phoned the undertaker, he said, no, you need to get a death certificate. So now when my parents died, I know the undertaker did all those sorts of things. But anyway, I thought, well, so I phoned the GP, who is a terribly nice man, and I have every confidence in. So I let him know that my aunt had died. And he said, well, what do you think? She died of Marion. And I said, well, really fragility of old age. And then she had the hip fracture. And then she had the COVID. Then she had pneumonia. So I said, those sorts of things probably all contributed to her death. So I got the death certificate. And it said, fragility of old age, fractured hip, pneumonia, COVID. So I thought, well, that's what I told the doctor. But
I don't think fragility of old age is a cause of death, but I just took it. And then I thought, you know, the reason why you have certification of death is a safeguard for people, you know, and I just felt if we're in a situation where, and I would have liked the doctor to have seen my aunt, because my aunt was emaciated. Now, it wasn't just in the care home that she had lost all that weight. She had lost that weight in hospitals too.
Yes.
And I mean, I would have liked a medical practitioner to have seen just how much she had really withered away.
And just in terms of the certification then, I think it's right. He went by your word effectively
I'm not casting any negative views on the GP. He's an excellent GP. I would have confidence in him. He would know I wouldn't mislead him. But I don't know that every family would have had that sort of relationship with the GP, or would have been in a trust relationship with the GP.
And I think if I can just come back to this then, Ms Reynolds, I know that obviously you're speaking on behalf of bereaved families as well. To what extent does your experience also reflect some of the broader experiences of the people within the bereaved families group?
Well, I think the sort of issues, I mean, really were quite systemic in that, I mean, the difficulties that people had in seeing their relatives, the difficulties they had in being confident that the care their relatives were receiving was of the standard that was appropriate. The fact that there were no safeguards in place in terms of other agencies going into the homes, the RQI inspectors. Paediatrists were stopped, OTs, all of these people, in a way, although they're providing a service, they're also a safeguard. Those services, once they're withdrawn, meant that the homes really were acting as little fiefdoms of their own. And the difficulty, I mean, I wasn't told of care partners, but neither were other people. And other people also had difficulty, even with that guidance, getting into homes. So those were issues that were common to all of us. I think some of our members also were very concerned that their relatives were given sedative-type medication, which probably hastened their demise. And now I was asked by the home after I got in to sign a non-resuscitation. Now, I would have signed that because the idea, I have done CPR and I would not have put my aunt through CPR because it would have been a total unkindness. But I knew from our group that other people's relatives had those in place without them knowing about it or having had it discussed with them. And that's obviously a concern.
And just in terms of, you've also set out in your witness statement just some of the broader concerns as well. So not the concerns about how people were cared for, but the broader concerns as well about the way that the response to the pandemic was managed by government in Northern Ireland. Is that right?
Well, yes, I think some of our members were very concerned that the executive had been down for 3 years, was re-established in January of 2020, and they were concerned. A lot of members were concerned that with a new minister who hadn't experienced and come straight into a worldwide pandemic. Now, I probably wouldn't share that concern to the same degree because having worked in the department, government ministers change. They all get their first day briefings. They all rely on their advisors and they very quickly read into the situation. So I probably don't share the same anxiety that a lot of our group do, but those people who had that anxiety, it caused them anxiety because they then didn't have reliance on the system. And that's an issue. You know, if you can't rely on the system, you're concerned about how the science is being used, how we're learning, how we're making changes over time. Now, I think at the very beginning, one could see the need for what we would now say was quite draconian measures. But as time went on and we learned more about the pandemic, and we learned who were vulnerable, and we learned more about how it was spread, there wasn't really the approach to moving forward based on the acquired knowledge. It seemed, especially for people in care homes, and this is one reason why I stayed involved with the group after my aunt died, care homes still weren't opening up. People were still being deprived of their family, their friends, their clergy. And I just thought this was wrong.
Thank you. And I think one of the other concerns that you've pointed out in your statement is just the effect that having an absence of ministers had on the 3 years running up to the pandemic as well. Yeah. Is that right?
Well, I think one of the things that would have impacted would be legislative change. There's a huge backload of legislation, and if the pandemic required legislative change, there really wouldn't have been a time in the legislative timetable to do that. So that would have been a concern, and I would share that concern.
Ms Reynolds, those are all my questions. Let me just see if the Chair has any.
I have no questions. I don't think anybody's asked to ask any questions. Thank you very much indeed, Ms Reynolds. I can see why you were so fond of your aunt. She sounds quite a character.
Well, she was.
Anyway, thank you very much for your help.
Thank you.
I think I have to leave because of
yes.
managing the next witness's entrance. Okay. 2 minutes. Scott.
Good afternoon, my lady. Please may the inquiry call Nuala Toman.
Repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall
be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Sir.
Thank you.
Good
Thank you
afternoon.
for waiting to the end of the day. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Good afternoon, Ms Toman. Would you please provide your full name for the inquiry?
Nuala Toman.
Thank you for your assistance to the inquiry. If I can just ask you to keep your voice up, speak into the microphone, and also not to speak too quickly, although I may be more guilty of that than you. I may ask you to repeat some of all of your answers, if it's not clear what you've said, and if you need a break at any point, please just say. You provided the inquiry with a witness statement dated the 19th of January 2024. I take it you're familiar with the contents of that statement. And at page 27, there's your signature and the statement of truth. Please can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true?
Yes.
And are you content to rely on that statement in evidence to the inquiry?
Yes.
And my lady, we request permission for that witness statement to be published.
Certainly, that will be the default setting.
Thank you, my lady. Ms Toman, you are the Head of Innovation and Impact at Disability Action Northern Ireland, and that the role and work of Disability Action can be summarised in the following way. It's the largest pan-disability organisation in Northern Ireland, represents more than 300 organisations. It works with people with various disabilities. We advocate for the rights of deaf and disabled people and provide them with services, and those services reach with about 100,000 people per year.
That's correct.
And as you do in your statement, you encapsulate deaf and disabled people with just the term disabled people, and I'll do the same for these questions. Would you please be able to provide just some brief examples of what life is like in Northern Ireland for people with disabilities, and in particular, those who rely upon day centres, provision of personal care, assisted housing, residential homes?
Is this during the pandemic or in general during the pandemic? Disabled people during the pandemic were isolated, lonely, social care had collapsed. Disabled people faced challenges accessing food and medicine, with many disabled people going hungry. Added to that, we were largely invisible amongst public decision-making processes, and our voices went unheard. In terms of housing, the lack of socially adapted homes meant that many disabled people were living in unsafe and unsanitary conditions, and without access to social care had to live on the ground floor of their homes without access to proper toileting or bedroom facilities.
Thank you. If I can just take you back a little earlier in time, a paragraph of your paragraph 15 of your witness statement, you say that in disability actions experience, disability inequality is pervasive within Northern Ireland. Disabled people in Northern Ireland are not afforded the same level of equality and protections in comparison with their counterparts in the rest of the United Kingdom and in Ireland. Could you please provide some specific day-to-day examples relating to the pandemic that show how disabled people in Northern Ireland were at a disadvantage compared to those in the rest of the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland?
The legacy of underinvestment in our public services is so severe that, as I've outlined, disabled people faced a number of significant challenges. Firstly, social isolation and the collapse of social care. Those who did have access to social care reported significant challenges with respect to the provision of PPE for people who were providing them with support and care. There was added to this a lack of infrastructure through which to identify and provide essential services to disabled people. This is largely characterised by the lack of cross-departmental cooperation that has been evidenced by other people. For example, the Department for Communities led the emergency food response, whilst organisations supporting disabled people and disabled children were funded by the Department of Health. As a result of this, disabled people's organisations and organisations representing disabled children were not involved in the food emergency response planning, and disabled people and disabled children were largely invisible, meaning that they had no access to food or medicine. Parents of disabled children had no access to respite facilities. This was combined with an absence of bespoke housing, leading...
Sorry, just to cut across you there. There's a number of those aspects that you set out that sound like they have roots prior to the pandemic, so they're not situations that necessarily arose in the very early stages. Is it right that there is a history of inequality in Northern Ireland that arose prior to the pandemic?
There's no doubt that Northern Ireland as a society has been characterised by historical inequality and discrimination that is reflected in our both our recent and past history. That said, the approach to decision making in the pandemic greatly increased the challenges facing disabled people by rendering us invisible, isolated, unheard, and in many cases uncared for.
Because you say in paragraph 28 of your statement that one of the effects of the absence of power sharing was that there were no ministers to engage with, so no one in place to address inequalities that are there. Are you also saying that was the situation any better when ministers were back in their post in 2020?
So the political infrastructure within Northern Ireland is complex. So in the absence of a functioning government, decisions were being made by unelected civil servants, and at that time disabled people told us that they felt like they were living under a dictatorship. The reinvigoration of the executive was, of course, welcome. That said, the reinstatement of ministers did little to improve the position of disabled people. The emphasis placed upon decision-making on addressing the larger political issues and the challenges presented by cross-departmental working through the enforced five-party coalition were such that disabled people fell through the cracks and were largely unaddressed and unacknowledged within decision-making processes. That's exemplified through the absence of data, the absence of reference to disabled people in strategies that were published during COVID.
If I can just jump in there, because there's a couple of elements in there, data and engagement, that I'd like to come back to. If I can just deal with the data point now, you set out in, if I can just take you to, it's 396793, which is a Assembly's all-party group on learning disability from May 2018, which will just come up on your screen. And it's in the box on the left-hand side, marked number 3. While it's vital to have a clear picture about the numbers of people with a learning disability in order to appropriately target resources and improve outcomes, there's a general lack of disaggregated data in Northern Ireland for this population. So that was 2018. Had the situation improved by the time that the pandemic commenced?
No, and there continues to be a lack of available data regarding disabled people in Northern Ireland.
Well, yes, you say that you're not aware of any statistics available detailing the number of disabled people resident in care homes in Northern Ireland. Is that still the case?
To my knowledge, yes.
And how is it, to your knowledge, that you are able to identify and then meet the needs of disabled people in Northern Ireland if you don't actually have any sufficient data about disabled people themselves?
From the public services perspective?
And from your perspective as a charity that represents them?
So from our perspective, we're a disabled persons-led organisation who have developed services for disabled people delivered by disabled people. We have a large network of organisations that we work with collectively, and on the basis of our service delivery, we are connected to disabled people throughout the region. For example, we deliver transport on a regional basis, and our membership extends across every county in Northern Ireland. We deliver employment services, and again, we deliver those services across the whole of Northern Ireland. And I suppose it shouldn't be left to us as a charity to identify disabled people on behalf of government, but by working together and the networks that we have, we do the best that we can, and we do deliver services for more than 100,000 disabled people annually.
So does your knowledge of the disabled people who use your services come from that interaction that you have, rather than any kind of objective sources of information that you may gather separately?
So we also, as an organisation, conduct research and regularly survey disabled people about their views on service provision in Northern Ireland, and we collect data regularly throughout the year. For example, a survey that we conducted in partnership with the Equality Commission identified that 9 out of 10 disabled people do not feel that housing and other services are accessible to them.
Thank you. There was a line that people will remember from the course of the pandemic in the context of the virus does not discriminate. As far as disabled people are concerned, does that line paint the whole picture?
No, and I think we need to acknowledge that in the context of the pandemic, that real-time data regarding the number of disabled people who died due to Covid-19 was not available. It was continually sought after, and when it became available in late 2021, that data showed that disabled people, the number of deaths from Covid-19 accounted for a disproportionate amount of disabled people. So in that respect, disabled people were more likely to die from the virus than other groups.
Yes.
And by the time this data was published, we were well into the pandemic, and it's important to recognise that at the outset, every single message in the early days of the pandemic pointed towards the additional vulnerability of both older people and disabled people to COVID-19.
Yes, if you say in your statement that I think disabled people were 42% more likely to die of COVID-19 than non-disabled people. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
Yes. And when you were talking about the data that was produced, was that December 2021?
Yes.
That came from NISRA? Would it have been assistance for that data to have been provided, if it was possible to do so, prior to the second wave, for example?
I think it would have been essential, particularly in a region whereby there are statutory obligations through which to both identify and mitigate the impact of policy and practice on disabled people and other Section 75 groups. And those statutory functions cannot be effectively completed in the absence of data.
Yes. In terms of that Section 75 function, I think one of the points you seek to make is that there's the duty to mitigate as part of that function. Do you feel, as far as disabled people in Northern Ireland are concerned, that sufficient was made of that duty to mitigate?
There's no available evidence at this time to indicate that there were particular mitigations put in place for disabled people, and that's apparent from the lack of engagement, the lack of visibility, and the absence of a targeted response towards disabled people during the pandemic.
One of the aspects that you've touched upon earlier on today is the cessation or reduction of care and services. Are you able, or do you have any view on the reason why those services in particular were reduced or ceased to function?
I think there were particular concerns around the transmission of COVID-19, and we have referred to that as the tension between trying to protect disabled people against the spread of the virus, but also leaving disabled people without access to care and support, and that extended to food and medicine, therefore effectively creating worsening conditions for disabled people and breaching their human rights.
Yes, we heard the very powerful accounts this morning in the video from Joanne and then Jim and Peter about the impact of people who weren't receiving the care or those who didn't have any family and nobody to speak for them. Would you be able to describe the risk of either significant harm or the risk caused by loneliness, particularly for those with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities, of the reduction or cessation of those kind of services during the pandemic?
So the research that we conducted throughout April 2020 demonstrated that the collapse of social care led to decline in physical and mental health. We also have case study accounts from disabled people who describe being left dirty, lying in their beds, unable to go to the toilet, feeling hungry and not having access to food. We've had accounts from disabled people that are harrowing, of a young disabled man who, with access to care, could access his day-to-day employment, but without access to personal care assistance, he was left in his home trying to access his toilet by crawling up the stairs.
And I think you set out in your statement difficulties with access to transport and food and medicines, so I won't ask you about that now. But did disabled children and their families face any particular difficulties in relation to school closures or changes to daycare centres, for example?
So during the first wave, special educational needs schools closed. disabled children and their families reported significant challenges in terms of having access to the necessary equipment to undertake education activities at home. Disabled children and families were left alone and isolated. Parents didn't have access to support to allow them to continue to develop their children's cognitive needs. Added to that, parents were experiencing emotional distress and mental distress as a result of having an absence of a wider support network around them, and have told us that they were left alone and isolated.
And I mean, you've given some examples there. How pervasive were those experiences amongst disabled people in Northern Ireland? Did it apply to a small number, a large number? Have you ever given any kind of rough indication of the scale of the impact?
So in the context of Northern Ireland, 1 in 4 disabled, 1 in 4 people are disabled people. The challenges that I'm outlining, certainly for disabled children who were pupils in special educational needs schools, those experiences are uniform across that particular group of children.
Do you know roughly how many that is? Or is that, we're lacking data on that as well?
There will be data around the exact number of children enrolled in special educational needs schools. I just don't have it to hand at this particular instance, but we can provide you with that if you require it. And added to that, I mean, disabled people represent an incredibly diverse population. But if you look at the survey that we conducted, we had 1,700 responses, of which something like 65% reported a decline in physical and mental health, and a further 37% reported challenges in terms of access and food and medicine. So for us, if you attribute that to the wider population of disabled people, what you see is an extent of experience that impacts upon a large majority of disabled people. The people that we work with experienced everything from fear of going into hospital, wondering who would feed them, through to inability to access health appointments, to people who were blind and visually impaired being unable to access their doctors because they're being asked to take photographs of injuries and rashes and being able to do so without assistance.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. I don't want to push you any further in terms of any examples that have been provided. I want to move on now to another topic in terms of the mortality differences and communication. You say in your statements, Disability Action's view that mortality differences between disabled people and non-disabled people must be understood in the context of the failure to consider communication needs of disabled people when providing public health information. You go on to say that there are usually 2 main factors in relation to disabled people accessing information. Disabled people are less likely to be able to access the information than the general population, and depending on conditions and impairments, they're less likely to be able to understand and/or follow it without appropriate adjustments. This leaves disabled people more vulnerable to infection and illness and more likely to further the transmission of the virus. As far as you're concerned, did public health messaging fall short of recognising those issues?
Yes, and for example, if you're blind or visually impaired, if you receive a letter in a form of communication, you may require someone else to read that to you. If you're socially isolating and don't have someone to do that, then you have no access to that information.
Sorry, in terms of any specific examples you could give about how the messaging just wasn't fitting what you described as disabled people need in order to make sure they're keeping themselves safe?
So the messaging was inaccessible in the format that it was delivered, particularly information that was delivered by letter. The public health information that was made available through TV communications was inaccessible because it wasn't tailored towards people with learning disability. There was an absence of information available via BSL or ISL vlogs beyond some of the news reporting which was interpreted. There was an absence of easy read information, and in the context of changes to how people accessed services, including, going to a supermarket, there were no audio descriptions to explain or raise awareness of the need to socially isolate, or even to alert people who are blind or visually impaired to the fact that they had to queue outside a shop. And we know that some blind and visually impaired people actually walked into the doors of the supermarket because they were completely unaware in the early days of the pandemic that the way in which people were accessing supermarkets had completely changed.
Thank you. We know that those communication difficulties were known about very near the start of the pandemic, if not before the pandemic. These weren't matters that were discovered during the course of the pandemic, were they?
No.
Did anybody from the government engage with you as a disability organisation in terms of how such messaging would be able to most effectively reach disabled people?
We had very limited engagement with any public officials or politicians throughout the pandemic. No one reached out to us to ask for advice on accessible communication.
What was the level of engagement generally with you as a representative organisation from the government in terms of the impact of the pandemic upon disabled people in Northern Ireland?
So we had one meeting with an ethics forum in response to a letter written to Minister Swan. We also had some very limited engagement around the disability strategy, which did not at all focus on COVID-19. We had a commitment to meet with both the First and Deputy First Minister, which didn't happen because the political institutions then collapsed. There was absolutely no strategic approach to engaging with disabled people throughout the pandemic, to such an extent that we had to work with MLAs to establish an ad hoc review of the impact of COVID-19 on disabled people. So we literally had to work together to create a forum for disabled people to share their experiences and to try and have these placed on public record.
You used the word forum there. The inquiry will hear evidence about other organisations and groups that were created in certain different sectors. What benefit do you consider that there would have been if there had been a forum or an organisation which would have been engaging with the government in Northern Ireland about the impact of the pandemic upon disabled people in Northern Ireland?
I think what we need is to ensure that disabled people are at the heart of decision making by creating structures that allow the voices of disabled people to be heard. Then our requirements are built in from the outset, and medications and approaches can be developed to ensure that the requirements of disabled people are met. Like, for example, something very, very simple, better communication between the Department for Communities and the Department for Health could have ensured that Disability Action or a similar organisation or children in Northern Ireland were represented on the emergency response group. And in doing that, an access pipeline to disabled children and disabled people would have been there from the outset, meaning that disabled people and disabled children would have had access to food and medicine on an equal basis with others.
And finally from me, Ms Toman. Paragraph 114 of your statement, you say, the safety of deaf and disabled people should be a core consideration and their emotional and social well-being prioritised in the planning of services. Do you feel like that happened in response to the COVID-19 pandemic in Northern Ireland?
No, unfortunately, disabled people were neglected, forgotten, left behind, not taken into account in terms of the processes of decision making. And it's very sad to say that the legacy of political dysfunction and all of the challenges that were outlined today in terms of decision making meant that we simply didn't have a voice, that our needs were so low on the agenda that we simply were not heard. And unfortunately, in this jurisdiction, there are statutory obligations in place that, if they were upheld, would have changed the story entirely. It's a legal requirement to consider disabled people from the outset in terms of policy development, and unfortunately, that didn't happen. But the framework is there.
Thank you, Ms Toman. Those are all the questions that I have. My lady, as I understand it, there are no live Rule 10 requests.
I think there's some. Mr. Wilcock has. It's Campbell.
Yes.
We did have some questions which we were permitted to ask, but in fact, given the clarity and the content of the evidence that we've just heard from Ms Toman, in fact, everything's been covered, and we're very grateful.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. Sorry, I should have trusted you, Mr Scott. Thank you very much indeed for coming to assist the inquiry. I'm very grateful to you, and I'm sorry you had such a sad story to tell.
Sorry, thank you.
People are treated. Very well, I think that completes the evidence for today.
Yes, my lady.
And 10 o'clock tomorrow morning?
Yes, my lady.
Thank you all very much.
All rise.